Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking about a book that I recently completed with my co-author, Peter Bearman. And it's really nice to come home to Brown and to Providence. These are the places where I acquired my sociological imagination. I was driving up 95 today and just was overcome with nostalgia walking down Fair Street. I feel like I'm 19 again. I know I don't look like I'm 19 anymore. Okay, so this book was inspired by a research project that began in the summer of 2014 as an action research program inspired by the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. In collaboration with a labor organization, the organization United for Respect at Walmart, we sent 20 college students in teams of 4 to 5 different parts of the country: Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, southeastern Ohio, and central Florida. And we had 2 goals in mind. One, that our students would collect oral history interviews with Walmart workers, and 2, that they would help to organize Walmart workers embedded within these chapters of this labor organization. As a side note, 3 of the 20 students were actually Brown University undergrads. The oral histories, we thought, would help us understand the situations, hopes, and aspirations of those working at Walmart. The organizing would help us to change these situations. This was meant to be an exercise in public sociology. Public sociology, from the beginning, Karl Marx, right? Let me say up front that in terms of our political ambitions for the project, it was an unambiguous failure. An unambiguous failure. Our 20 students recruited 22 members over the course of 9 weeks. 15 of the 22 were recruited in Ohio. The modal number of recruits was 0. And even in Ohio, the students had to work approximately 100 hours for every one new recruit. The uncomfortable truth is that our Walmart wasn't doing all that much better. Over the course of approximately 5 years and millions of dollars, the membership of this nascent labor organization had grown to a little less than 5,000. Assuming 0 turnover, that's about 0.3% of a workforce of about 1.4 million. More realistically, if we assume about 40% turnover at Walmart and attrition from the organization, it's closer to 1/20th of 1% of the Walmart workforce. It was incredibly difficult for us or for our Walmart to organize Walmart workers. And so the puzzle I'd like to discuss today, which is the puzzle that animates the book, is why. Why is it so hard to organize low-wage workers in the US, and how might it be possible? Let me situate this question in historical context, which many of you, if some of you are thinking about the future of work, you probably already know. The decline of manufacturing and rise of the service sector in the US has transformed the labor market, and this transformation is partially responsible for declining rates of unionization, since unions have traditionally been most prevalent in manufacturing. The declining percentage of union members nationally closely tracks the decline of US manufacturing. But of course, the decline of manufacturing is not a sufficient explanation for declining unionization. Other countries have experienced declines in manufacturing while sustaining high rates of unionization. And it's difficult to understand exactly why rates of unionization in the service sector remain so low. Many aspects of the service sector would actually suggest greater, not lesser, union penetration. On the surface, service sector workers have some sources of structural power that are absent in traditional manufacturing contexts. Consider, for example, that service sector industries, from healthcare to retail to hotels, cannot outsource production very easily, nor can they easily replace workers with machines. while the changing structure of the economy explains why it may be harder to unionize in manufacturing industries, and while the union premium in these industries has declined over time, it doesn't tell us much about the failure of unions to break into or reunionize industries like healthcare, education, and retail. Ever since President Reagan broke the air traffic controller strike in 1981 by summarily firing over 11,000 workers, many have argued that increased employer opposition to unions and political hostility explain the decline of US labor, a point made nicely by Jake Rosenfeld in his What Unions No Longer Do. There's certainly a temporal correlation, and the rise of the anti-union industry in the past 50 years has played an important role in undermining organizing attempts. But employers' advantage under US labor law go back far earlier than the recent upsurge of employer anti-unionism that began in the late 1970s. The whole of American history overflows with moments in which the state has sided with employers over workers. The history of key battles in early American labor history, Pullman, Homestead, Cripple Creek, Haymarket, the Ludlow Massacre, helped to put contemporary anti-unionism in perspective. In short, we have over 150 years of state-led opposition to unionism. Nothing's really all that different except that maybe the level of violence perpetrated against workers is somewhat less now. Old, bureaucratic, and uninspiring union organizations also get much of the blame, and the glacial pace at which they've recognized the transformation of the US economy is certainly also a factor here, a point made well by Jane McAlevey in her No Shortcuts. But at least since the Justice for Janitors campaign in the 1980s, many unions have made massive investments in new organizing. Several of the biggest service sector unions broke with the AFL-CIO in 2005 to form the Change to Win coalition and focus on organizing the service sector. And so we didn't feel like existing arguments satisfactorily explained the difficulties that we encountered in the field, or the difficulties that our Walmart, a well-funded, creative, ambitious new labor organization, encountered. And so whereas existing accounts of union decline tend to focus either on the macro forces of economic and political transformation or micro processes of organizational strategy and leadership, what we focus on is the middle range, at the way that workers' embeddedness in relations structure the way they understand their lives, their jobs, and their aspirations. A revitalized labor movement requires at least a form of class consciousness. And why is this so hard to achieve in the contemporary period? What we wound up recognizing, which is a point that is probably sort of obvious, is that in order to understand the possibility of worker organization today, we had to get inside the experiences of low-wage workers and low-wage workplaces. So we went back to the interviews that our students conducted in the field in 2014 and supplemented this with all sorts of other material. The 35,000 Yelp reviews written about Walmart, more than 9,000 Glassdoor reviews of Walmart written on Glassdoor.com. This is a website where workers can review their jobs. A survey of more than 6,000 workers, Walmart workers, that we conducted on Facebook. Store visits. Text from an online discussion group consisting of over 20,000 Walmart workers. I even dragged my then 7-year-old daughter to Walmart's in New Jersey and made her take field notes. Really unhelpful, it turns out. Girls, they're only girly swimsuits, turns out. Okay, so this book is a result of our various engagements. Here's a map showing the location of each of the approximately 4,000 Walmarts in the country. The first thing that struck us about the data we collected was that there's no typical Walmart worker. Walmart's workforce of 1.4 million is a full percentage point of the civilian labor force. If Walmart were its own state, it would be about 40% larger than the state of Rhode Island. And the state of Walmart workers would be filled with people of all ages, ethnicities, and motivations. Older people on the brink of retirement who are working there because they've always worked somewhere, or because their old jobs disappeared, or because they just want to have a place to be, or because they want to be close to their children and this was the only game in town. Young people who are paying the bills while they go to community college, or who have already climbed to customer service manager after only 6 months and are sure they can climb higher, or who got stoned too much in high school and may still be stoned as they wander somewhat aimlessly around the toy department. 40-something women who are trying to support their families on Walmart wages, who are comparing notes with other 40-something women in the grocery department about what kinds of dairy products they can buy with WIC benefits. 50-something women who are bored to death at home while their husbands work and are so happy to be around other people. People who've just found a home after months of homelessness, who have recently been released from prison, who've returned from military service, who've escaped abusive relationships, who've struggled with mental illness. What this means is that people come to jobs at Walmart with hugely different understandings of what the job is, what they want from it, what they expect, and what they feel entitled to. And this heterogeneity matters for at least 2 reasons. One, because the diversity itself complicates the formation of a collective identity. And 2, because for many coming from a range of situations, work at Walmart compared to where they have come from or where they fear going actually looks, and in many cases is by comparison, relatively good. So let me start with the kind of story with which many of us in this room are probably familiar. It's one memorialized by Michael Moore's Roger and Me and Amy Goldstein's more recent Janesville. Some workers compare Walmart jobs to the manufacturing jobs they've lost. When we found these accounts, we found them most often in Rust Belt Walmarts, like the one in Franklin, Ohio, where many workers found jobs after the nearby Moraine General Motors factory was closed in 2008. These workers were, by and large, more amenable to labor organization than any others we encountered. Of anywhere in the country, Franklin was the store where our students had the most luck, and it seemed likely to do with the dispositions and expectations that workers at the store had formed before they ever got there. As one of our students wrote, this is one of our students writing about this worker, Gerald. So Gerald, in the photo department, he went off, calling Walmart a bunch of labor-stealing motherfuckers, calling this or that manager an asshat, and expressing his frustrations with the lunatic half of the store that opposed advocating for themselves. Labor-stealing motherfuckers is a language that didn't arise within Walmart. It arose from this man's experience working in the factory at AK Steel. For these workers, Walmart plays a triple role. First, as the antagonist, the dispossessor, the company that takes advantage of and speeds up the flood of goods from far-flung parts of the globe. Second, as the employer of last resort, the place that will pay you half as much to hawk cheaper versions of the goods you once produced yourself. And finally, as a last-ditch provider, the place that will sell things cheaply enough for you to squeak by on your paltry paycheck. It's Fordism in reverse, with the same result of stoking customer demand. Rather than pay you enough to buy the car you're producing, Walmart will pay you so little you're compelled to shop there. Less than 15 miles away from Franklin is another Walmart supercenter, this one on the outskirts of Dayton, in a shopping center just across the boundary that separates the suburb of Centerville from Dayton proper. Our students tried just as hard to get things going in the Centerville Walmart, and they had absolutely no luck. They could barely get anyone to speak to them, much less spark any interest in joining this organization. The tension that our students felt in the Franklin Walmart, the sense that people were aware of things not being right, it was just missing in Centerville. Their intuition was that it had something to do with the different demographics of the place. Centerville seemed fancy. Compared to the Walmart in Franklin, the associates at the Centerville store seemed either much younger or much older. And they were onto something. The average household income was close to $80,000 around the Centerville store, compared to $46,000 around Franklin. What it meant was that people who tended to work at the Centerville store were much further from the average worker locally than those who worked at Franklin. In Centerville, Walmart workers were disproportionately high school students, retirees, moms who were getting out of the house for a few hours, people who likely thought of their jobs quite differently than those who were the primary providers for their families, as it seemed like many were in Franklin. The Centerville workers were building different kinds of jobs at Walmart because they were coming from different places. And because they were doing something different, they built a different local culture, one that was antithetical to labor organization. We spoke to many workers like the workers in Centerville, workers who were comparing Walmart not to unionized factory jobs, but to the everyday mundanity of being at home with a kid. Those of you who have young children know this kind of mundanity. Like Myra Rodriguez in California, who told us, I was just tired of staying home. I was tired of Blue's Clues and Sesame Street and Bob the Builder and all that stuff. I just needed to get out, so I got a part-time job. For women relegated to the domestic sphere, work at Walmart was sometimes experienced as liberating. For retirees who felt lonely, Walmart was sometimes experienced as a nice way to pass the time. And then there are many people we found who are comparing jobs at Walmart to things that are much worse, to incarceration, to homelessness, to hunger, to violence. As the economist Joan Robinson once quipped, the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. When 2 Walmarts opened in Washington, D.C. in 2013, over 23,000 people applied for 600 jobs, leading to this story in the Washington Post. When good jobs are scarce, people end up accepting wage deals that are worse than minimum wage. Some of the people we met would commute as long as 2 hours to and from a job at Walmart, which, if you add to an 8-hour workday, means people are willing to work for about a third less than whatever little amount Walmart's paying. The rise of mass incarceration and fraying of the social safety net, discussed as the twin transformations of the state in the contemporary period, might be understood, at least the way I'd like us to think about it, is as social enclosures, akin to the enclosure of the commons in 18th century England. Processes that made the alternatives to low-wage work at places like Walmart that much worse. One interviewee described why he stayed at Walmart as follows. The reason why I've been at Walmart so long is I have a charge on my record. There was 2 decent jobs that my background denied me from getting. I'm stuck. That's why I gave Walmart a better attitude. I tried not to worry about so much what was going on, to try to just block that out and work. A criminal record forced him to keep his head down and stay at Walmart far longer than he otherwise would. Similarly, at a more macro level, we can see that the period of greatest growth for Walmart historically, both absolutely and relative to the rest of the economy, was in the 3 years after the passage of welfare reform, 1996, 1999, a time when poor women with children were getting pushed into the labor market at increasing rates. For those who used to have a union and a pension, Walmart might seem like a bunch of labor-stealing motherfuckers. But for those who are looking to get out of the house, or stay out of prison, or stay out of a shelter, it doesn't look so bad. Of course, in order to make sense of Walmart, it's not enough to understand the lack of other options, those factors that push people into this sort of low-wage work. It's not just defined by the stochastic vulnerability outside of it. Despite the heterogeneity of experiences that lead people to the company, people do encounter a fairly similar regime once they arrive, a regime that could serve as the basis of collective identity, but rarely does. And much of what workers encounter, we found, doesn't at first feel all that bad. And this may be because people go out of their way to try to find meaning in their work. We all carve out spaces in which we're able to feel autonomous and creative. We search for distinction and respect. People are often proud of their jobs when they do them well, and frustrated when they're not given the space or tools to get their jobs done right. Walmart makes use of these inclinations to maximize the work they can get out of employees, creating little micro games through which workers can win recognition as they maximize productivity, allowing workers to take ownership, for example, over a display or a product. This is not in itself new. A long history of scholarship on the labor process documents how the mid-20th century workplace was one in which raw coercion of a previous era had given way to manufactured consent. Human resource departments and strong labor unions had created structures like internal labor markets and incentive payment systems to align workers' interests with the interests of their employers. Walmart and other low-wage employers use the same principles without meaningful internal job ladders and unions with which they were associated. It turns out that one can manufacture consent without all that many rewards at stake. For instance, this is the account of Jamal Green from Cincinnati. I was the best cashier. You know what I mean? Not to brag or anything, but we had what they call SPH, and that's scans per hour. So they time how fast you're moving. And I just kind of took it as sport. LeBron James would score 44 points in a game, have 10 assists and 15 rebounds. So I'm like, I can get my SPH up to 1,000, up to 1,500. And I had it so high, it was at 2,400 scans per hour. My store manager was telling me that's the highest in the whole district. One can find no better evidence of the pride that Walmart workers take in their work than if one logs on to the largest online discussion boards of current and former Walmart employees and behold the Walmart shelfies, a term that we invented. Shelfies, trademark. A worker from the apparel department shows off her meticulously folded and color-coordinated sweaters. Oh, this took me so long, but look how perfect it is. I'm going to cry when I come back tomorrow and it's destroyed. Another posts a picture of hundreds of perfectly placed acrylic paints, bemoaning that she didn't get a before picture to show just how much work she put into it. A third posts that she built her first feature today, a special display of Toll House chocolate chips in various flavors and colors, and wants people's feedback. As remarkable as the pictures themselves are the responses to them. For every banal good job or very nice, there's another comment that's thoughtful, specific, constructive. For instance, there's an emergent consensus that there's too much space between the shelves of the Toll House chocolate chips, suggesting that there might have been room for another shelf. Writes one associate, "My boss is a stickler about airspace. He would have yelled at me for that, but I think it looks great." Another agrees, adding, "You can't sell air," before assuring, "You did a really good job, though." A third writes, "Good job," before echoing the airspace concern and suggesting that an entire end cap of chocolate chips might be overkill, and that half a shelf should be of a different item that sells well with chocolate chips. I'll spare you the rest. There are few compliment the striping of the colors, the different kinds of chocolate chips, although even here there's some dissent. The pull of Walmart is not just distinction. Walmart also gives many a real sense of community. As Sue Rogers from Cincinnati recounts, I knew everybody in that store. Everybody, it was like a big family. Everybody I knew, and we had good times. We had Halloween parties where we'd be dressed up and go around giving the kids candy that come in the store. They even have pictures of us doing the chicken dance going up and down the aisle. Coworkers are often literally one's family. In our survey of Walmart workers on Facebook, 42% said that they had a family member who also worked at Walmart or had worked there at some point. A third had a family member who worked at the very same Walmart where they worked. At its best, people feel both a sense of individual recognition and community from their peers at the company. We can see evidence of this in the ways that associates review their jobs at the company on a job site like Glassdoor. The most frequent noun used to describe the pros of the job by far is the people. Among workers as a whole, it's the people that make the difference. Now we can take this one step further and look at the pros nouns that are most strongly associated with higher overall job ratings. The word most highly associated with how much one likes the job at Walmart is culture, with words like environment, team, and family close behind. Now, these are the associates who see the store as theirs, not someone else's. They're the ones who can not only perform the Walmart cheer on command, give me a W, give me an A, but also know the specific cheers associated with their own store. 3261, keep the others on the run. 1823, Hanover is the place to be. 2136, the store that really kicks. These are workers who tell ghost stories about the particular stores. You need to feel a sense of connection, a sense of like history to be able to tell ghost stories about a place, I'd argue. We can also see the importance of relationships in our survey in another way. See the importance of relationships come across in our survey. Seeing customers that one knows from other parts of one's life, having friends at work, being able to ask one's coworkers for help. In our survey data, each of these is positively, significantly, and independently associated with job satisfaction, even after controlling for things like race, sex, age, whether one currently works at the store, and how long one's worked there. It's not that people don't identify problems with work. It's just that these problems are not what we would intuitively expect, not what I intuitively expected. For years, Walmart has been the poster child of the low-wage employer. More than the poster child, it's been the model that's helped lower the bar for workers across retail and adjacent industries. It's been doing so at a time when retail workers overall have been increasingly productive. Between 1987 and 2014, labor productivity across retail doubled, but average real wages were flat, meaning that workers were not able to claim for themselves any of the increased productivity they were making possible for their employers. Given this fact, it might come as a surprise that low pay is not the most common complaint among Walmart employees who post reviews on Glassdoor, among those we spoke to, among those who participate in the Walmart discussion board, among many interviews we conducted or during our store visits. I think this is the sleight of the invisible hand of the labor market. People are free to leave Walmart anytime. The pernicious psychological flip side to this exit option is that it implies, even for workers themselves, that they're choosing to stay. They're accepting the terms of the deal. Walmart doesn't owe them anything. For the typical American worker, the labor market is an abstraction, a weather pattern. Getting mad at Walmart for its low wages when low wages are everywhere is like getting mad at the rain. Our interviewees often felt like they had no choice but to suck it up. So if not wages, where do workers tend to direct their frustration? Towards the real people who make the abstraction of the labor market tangible. Store managers and co-managers and assistant managers are all identifiable. They have faces, names, walkie-talkies strapped to their belts, and collared shirts that distinguish them from everyday associates. The wages and benefits one is offered may feel like the result of distant and uncontrollable forces, but the manager's standing right in front of you. A manager makes someone feel their powerlessness at work. Absent a collectively negotiated labor contract with respect to actual work in an organization as distinct from personal services, there are few limits to what employers can and do ask of those for whom there's no serious exit option. The experience of working in a setting where there are few rules governing what can be asked of one was translated back among many workers as being in a jail. as one worker put it. Comparisons to prison and slavery are deployed with particular regularity by African American men at Walmart. Owen Taylor from Chicago, for example, said Walmart treated him like a slave without the shackles. For these men, Walmart feels analogous to the total institutions, to other total institutions that have defined Black American life. Joan Wharton was at the Franklin store in Ohio. Like Gerald, she had previously worked at AK Steel for $20 an hour and now worked at the Franklin Walmart for $9 an hour. She discussed the 60% drop in pay almost in passing. The difference she did notice between AK Steel and Walmart was the management. With the union at AK Steel, she said, there's union contracts, union rules, union representatives. If you were treated poorly by a manager, you could go talk to a rep. At Walmart, though, managers feel like they can step on anybody they want. They feel like they can talk to anybody they want. They can talk to anybody any way they want. There are no boundaries to what managers could ask of workers. The most frequent noun used to describe the cons of the job by far is the management. And among those who like their jobs least, it's because of the lack of respect they felt, the way they feel they were treated by those above them. Now, disrespect may be central to the grievances of all who work in low-wage jobs, but it seems particularly pronounced here. And why might this be the case? One reason may be because of the fact that retail work is a server system. There's uncertainty in the flow of customers and the subsequent flow of stuff. Little structures the flow of activities other than the movement of people and goods, which, given the ways in which schedules are structured, is effectively randomized. While Walmart has rationalized much of the logistics to maximize the efficiency of the flow of goods through its system in light of varying demand, there's still a huge element of uncertainty in the production process to which Walmart responds by allocating to their managers a high degree of discretion over staff allocation. If lines appear at the registers, managers shift associates off the floor. If cashiers are suddenly idle, managers have associates move stock. This helps to explain the puzzle that Walmart is at once hyper-rationalized. It's hyper-rationalized, and yet many associates don't actually have a stable job description. People are often cross-trained on 3 or 4 or 8 jobs. Compare this to an assembly line. On an assembly line, at least in theory, the structuring routines built in the machinery limit the extent to which a manager can wield arbitrary authority over work. A manager can't simply take people off one task and put them on another willy-nilly, as the line would likely stop. Managers can't change the structure of production as much, just its tempo. The arbitrary authority of management, the disrespect of work, is what most frustrates many Walmart workers about their jobs. These same features of the workplace that lead to this arbitrary authority also undermine historical strategies by which workers have achieved collective voice. On the assembly line, the predictability and interdependence of the production process provide the foundations for a sense of workers' collective identity. Management demands that impede the functioning of the line will be seen as illegitimate. There are defined work rules around which workers might negotiate, and perhaps most importantly, there's a credible threat that disobedience by a small fraction of the workforce will disrupt production for everyone by stopping the line entirely. These features are missing in the low-wage retail sector. And so what is a worker organization to do? Bob Moses, the civil rights leader who helped to spearhead Freedom Summer in 1964, was once asked how to organize a community. He replied, by bouncing a ball. You stand on the street and bounce a ball. Soon, all the children come around. You keep on bouncing the ball. Before long, it runs under someone's porch, and then you meet the adults. This imagery is profound in its simplicity. Moses' suggestion was that the processes of social interaction and relationship formation are central to the possibility of collective action. This is different, I want to say, from saying that existing relationships and networks are important to movement success, a point that's also important but more widely recognized. For Moses, organizing was about embedding oneself strategically within existing networks in order to help reshape these networks around collective goals. This is what organizers in Mississippi tried to do in '64. To build organization, one needs to identify existing networks, work within them, and turn them. People are embedded in all sorts of quasi-groups, latent pieces of social structure that can be activated to achieve collective ends. The ball running under the porch might allow one access to a quasi-group of conversation and meal sharing. And embedding in such quasi-groups may lead one to those more formal organizations that bind people together. By the time we visited our students in Ohio in late July, one could often find one of them sitting with Gerald and a group of other workers at the Franklin Store's Subway sandwich shop, one of Gerald's 2 offices. Gerald would be holding court, and our student would be sitting alongside. In his classic book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, have you all, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty? Albert Hirschman, he describes in a simple yet brilliant formulation the 2 possible responses to organizational problems: exit and voice. We'll return to loyalty in a minute. Exit, he argued, was the market response. If you don't like a product, you stop buying it. If you don't like an organization, leave. In the context of a labor market, or any market for that matter, exit is the option with which we're most familiar, and many workers at Walmart take advantage of it. That's why turnover rates are so high, as much as 40–50% per year. Somewhat ironically, the bigger obstacle to worker mobilization than fear of management reprisal might be the easiness of exit. Why stay and fight when the exits are right there? Most people don't. They leave. But while exit may be sensible from the perspective of an individual worker, it's likely detrimental to low-wage workers as a whole. The problem with exit is that it can only lead to organizational changes when there's some elasticity with respect to quality change and the demand for the good or the job the organization offers. If there's a large number of equally capable workers ready to take the spot of any Walmart worker who quits, it's unlikely that the organization will feel any pressure to change as a result of such turnover. If anything, the company will be happy to have the disgruntled worker disappear. Furthermore, if other options are just as bad, individual workers might not actually be better off exiting either. They might repeatedly exit bad jobs with the false hope that the next one will be better, wasting energy they might otherwise spend working to change any one of them. Despite the costs of turnover, the churn might help low-wage employers collectively avoid any claims on them. So the most sensible choices from the perspective of any individual worker are also the choices likely to leave the distribution of jobs unchanged. In Hirschman's formulation, one key determinant of a person or group's likelihood for using voice over exit is loyalty, by which he means not an unquestioning allegiance to an organization, but rather what he calls a special attachment that makes an actor willing to trade off the certainty of exit against the uncertainties of an improvement in the deteriorated product. Loyalty is not people doing nothing. Loyalty forces us to turn away from the easy exit and thereby pushes, according to Hirschman, men and women, into the alternative creativity requiring course of action from which they would normally recoil. Among those workers that we found got involved in our Walmart, it was connection to and loyalty to one another that encouraged them to get involved. This is, on its face, a little bit counterintuitive. It was the best parts of their job, their connections with one another, their codependencies at work, their sharing advice, their helping each other out, that provided both the motivation to fight against the company's unjust practices and provided the avenues, the channels through which this participation occurred. Of course, what's counterintuitive is also part of the labor organizers' common sense. Isolated, estranged workers are rarely those who participate or lead labor organizing drives. Rather, it's those who are already in some kind of instrumental, task-oriented relationship with one another. And this is why the production line with its, which can induce such task-oriented collaborative relationships, often provides an immediate foundation for joint action in pursuit of a common good. A wide variety of network processes got workers involved with our Walmart, but joining was always, or almost always, about being alongside others who joined. Signing was a decision made in relationship to others. We can see this in action by reconstructing a social network from organizers' conversation notes. That is, we had the notes of that organizers took when they were organizing, so we knew who they were talking to and which workers were talking to one another. This is in Pico Rivera, California. Workers are the dots, the nodes, and conversations among people are edges. Because of the leadership of 4 key leaders at the store, the self-described Pico Mighty Strikers, or PMS as they called themselves, grew quickly over the course of 2011 and 2012. Eventually, more than 120 would sign up for the organization. A core group of 4 committed activists soon snowballed into a critical mass. The experience of being part of this community was not one of self-interest, but one of transcendence. As Michelle Rogers put it, everybody wants to find their purpose on this earth, you know, and I find my purpose in that area, being able to speak for others who can't speak for themselves, to be able to stand up to management who think they were God. You know, I love it. It drives me. It's my passion, my sense, my purpose on this earth. It wasn't self-interest, but a sense of collective effervescence that motivated participation. Of course, this begs the question of what a tie actually is. Like, what is represented by the conversations here? And what are the types of social ties that lead to organization? We have all kinds of social ties with other people. People we like, people we trust, people we argue with. What we found is that the ties most important to organizing are the ties of trust rather than friendship. We can see evidence of this in a couple of different ways. First, this is a sort of proxy method. Using our Walmart records, we can look at the order in which workers signed up for the organization and see how similar consecutive signers are, like one signer after another. See how similar they are along different dimensions, along different relational dimensions. The intuition is that consecutive signers, my time is done. Is it really? It's close. Give me 5 minutes, and then I'll be officially done. Workers are much more likely than chance to work in the same department as a previous card signer, but not much more likely than chance to be of the same gender, to live in the same type of neighborhood, etc. That is, homophily, the idea that like attracts like. Those principles that predict friendship are not the principles that predict co-signing into the organization. We also see this in the survey. How many friends one has at work is actually negatively related to support for the organization. But how often one asks for help from others at work was positively associated with support for the organization after controlling for a host of other factors. Of course, the problem is that this kind of dense network of trusting ties is costly to maintain, and lots of factors are working against them. One factor we've already seen, many potential leaders leave. Unstable schedules and varying department assignments don't help either. Another problem we have also already seen, whereas the machinery of production used to give workers structural power, this is missing in retail. During a one-day strike in November of 2014, Pico Rivera had the most participants of any store in the country, 19 or a bit less than 10% of the shop. Now, hypothetically, on an assembly line, 10% of workers could have shut it down, but not in retail. Finally, another obstacle is the sheer size and scale of Walmart, as well as the low fixed capital costs per worker. Since the turn of the 20th century, US corporations have tried to defeat every local organizing success by the same basic strategy: lift it to the next level, where unionization is more difficult or irrelevant. So what happened at PICO? In April 2015, PICO was shut down for plumbing problems, and all of the PMS leaders were laid off. Now, I'll just leave you with one sort of more optimistic idea about how labor might address the lack of structural power, its lack of structural power, and address the problem of scale. One strategy our Walmart is exploring is the use of an infrastructure online. I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, but right now there are hundreds of thousands of retail workers across different employers coming together in online spaces, talking about everything, their conditions of work, their lives outside of work, etc. This is a semantic network of 600,000 posts written by about 20,000 Walmart associates. Here we just look at like which noun phrases are used together in the same posts. And you can see sort of the breakdown of topics, and I can talk more about this. At least theoretically, these discussion boards could be places in which workers connect around common issues across disparate locations. The discussion boards, they were also being used in interesting ways during the recent wave of teacher strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky. But here the danger is the substitution of instrumental ties, of ties of purpose for ties of affection, for lowest common denominator triviality, and the naturalization of everyday life. So what creates the possibility of collective action here, if unmediated or mediated only by Facebook, winds up being mostly about cats and other things that we can all agree are cute and harmless. Okay, so to conclude, our Walmart counterfactual, the way we think of Walmart as being crappy in comparison to the jobs of the past, is different than many workers' counterfactuals. We compare Walmart with places like Ford or GM. Some do, some workers do, but many don't. Second, people try to find distinction and community at work, and Walmart is no exception. Third, more than higher wages, workers at Walmart want respect. The salience of arbitrary authority may be more salient, I would argue, in the service sector for the reasons I've argued than elsewhere. We saw our project as a lineage, part of a lineage of Freedom Summer, one of many projects that have tried to recapture the energy of Freedom Summer. By the late 60s, civil rights leaders had begun to shift their sights from negative conceptions of freedom to positive ones. King, most of us know, was supporting striking sanitation workers in Memphis when he was assassinated in '68. Speaking in Memphis that March, he referred to the limits of civil rights in the absence of economic rights. In building a bridge between racial and economic justice, King made the argument that negative freedom from interference, was incomplete without something more. In this case, the provision of material well-being. We were expecting to hear this same sort of call for positive freedom, for material well-being in the field in 2014. Instead, we found that people who work in low-wage jobs today are not only or even primarily striving for the material well-being. They're more basically working for respect. The best and worst parts of people's jobs have to do with their interactional relationships with one another. The struggle for respect is a struggle for non-dominating relationships. Where classical liberal theory defines freedom as freedom from interference, the workers we encountered at Walmart are not trying to free themselves from social relations so much as equalize them. The things they want depend on the constraint of social relations, on membership in a community of relative equals. The etymological roots of freedom, turns out, are in friendship. So simply put, our goal in the project became to better understand how people pursue this kind of freedom in the contemporary American workplace. How might they do so more effectively? So I've tried to give you a taste of what we discuss in the book, and I'm looking forward to talking with you more about it. Thank you. Bert.
You're talking about this shift from manufacturing to retail. Is there a momentum or a continuity issue around organizing? When we're shifting economies, is there a not sharing of the vocabulary? Is there momentum issues? I mean, what?
Yeah, so one way people have for explaining the decline of unions is to just say, well, the unionization happened in manufacturing, and manufacturing has declined, and unions have declined also. That's definitely true. What I'm arguing is that that fails to explain the difficulty of organizing in retail. Now, I think you're 100% right that organizing often happens in waves. So when did unionization happen? Well, almost all of it happened in the 1930s and 1940s, during before and during the Second World War. And actually, if you look at unionization rates since, it's almost none of union rates have to do with new organizing. It's almost all just the residual of this wave of organizing. And so you're exactly right that there is a continuity issue in that organizing in the past doesn't necessarily lead to organizing now. The question for me is what will it take to have a new wave? If you look at Flint, right, in 1930, late 1936, auto workers in Flint and in GM around the country, how different, this is actually not a comment, this is actually a question, how different were they from, and what were the distinctions between low-wage auto workers around the country at that point and Walmart workers? Now, there are definitely important distinctions, some of which I've argued as being a result of the difference between manufacturing and the service. I think there are also some similarities. And so what I'm interested in understanding is the obstacles to a new wave today.
Maybe the key word is new.
A new wave, right. It doesn't have to be traditional labor organizations, but our Walmart isn't a traditional labor organization. Yes?
I was involved in the early move to unionize the Harvard clerical technical workers, and I was also union rep for adjunct faculty at a community college for 7 years. And this is what I think the difference is, because I noticed this when I was working.
Yeah.
When you're absolutely desperate and you don't have a home and your kids are going to starve, you're easy to organize. I was really lucky. If I lost my job as a union, if I didn't get that course in the next semester, my husband worked full time. We weren't going to starve. It was okay, so we won't go on vacation. So what? But the people I was trying to work with had just enough, and there would be contract violations, and I'd sit down with someone and I'd say, look, this is the contract. This is why it's a violation. This is what we can do for you. This is the risk. Because there wasn't very much job protection. And people would look at me and they'd say, I can't risk it. If I don't make those car payments, I can't work at this other college. $2,000 a course, paid out every 6 weeks. And they couldn't risk it because they'd lose what little they had. And that's what I think does it.
So you think that, thank you for that perspective, by the way. I hear Brown University grad students just organized, Columbia University graduate students just organized. So there's little pockets of organizing that are happening. I don't think either of these graduate student groups fit the profile of the most desperate. But it's an interesting question about what level of hardship is necessary and sufficient for organizing. In our data, so one thing we did is we took all of the membership data we had in collaboration with our Walmart and looked at what characteristics at the individual and store level predict signing. And what we found in some ways was consistent with what you're saying, and in some ways was distinct. What was consistent is we did find that people who lived in poorer neighborhoods and neighborhoods in which there were higher proportions of people of color were more likely to sign up. So in that sense, we found something consistent. On the other hand, we found that the scale and scope of the criminal justice system actually operates in the other way. So the people who lived in neighborhoods where there was the threat of imprisonment, or people who had actually experienced imprisonment themselves, that actually cut in the other direction and made people more quiescent. And so I think that when we're thinking about how hardships related to mobilization, we have to think specifically about different kinds of hardship and what's the kind of causal story we're telling about how hardship relates to mobilization. Because different kinds of hardship, I think, relate to mobilization in different ways. Yeah, Rick.
So thanks, Adam. That was a really terrific talk and really interesting work. I guess I wanted to mine a couple of themes that came up. The first was kind of different, why people who are, let's say, Walmart doesn't have a assembly line but has some version of it. And what was interesting at the beginning is how people who look like they're doing the same work actually come to that work with a very different sense of purpose, identity, et cetera, which was true also for the assembly line. Right? And so your colleague, Chuck Sable, now at the law school there, wrote this great book, Work in Politics, which shows that even people who look like they're unskilled on the assembly line actually have very different kinds of identities. Some of them are just temporary, others thought that by doing it, maybe someday they could be skilled, et cetera. And so I wonder if the search for a one-size-fit-all strategy, whether it's for Walmart or for the factory of the past or universities, whatever it is, if that's ever going to work, as opposed to people are doing the work for different reasons, and tapping into that is important. And related is, when you talked about how organizing happened in the 30s and 40s, at least my memory of reading the labor history was that a lot of the organizing, even though it was organizing workers in the factory, it was happening outside of the factories. It was happening in, Jews organizing Jews, Italians, so through ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods, et cetera. I think of Neil, was it Lichtenstein?
Nelson
Lichtenstein's, work on that. And so again, based on what you said, it sounds like those identity things seem to be really important.
Yeah. These are both great comments. I think you're right that the search for a universal class identity is probably a search in vain. And actually, in the pockets of where there were mobilizations in Walmarts, they were actually pretty specific identities around which groups of workers came together. So in Pico Rivera, it was like women coming together, talking about the ways they were being treated as women. That's the joke of PMS, right? In Florida, it was a kind of religious identification. Like the workers there, those who got involved, they were doing it through David taking on Goliath. In Chicago, it was very much a legacy of civil rights, like a group of African-American workers sort of continuing the legacy of civil rights. And so it was very much particular identities that were connecting them to labor struggle. The other thing I'd say, and again, I feel like I'm not a labor historian, so I'm looking for parallels historically without knowing a whole lot about them. But my understanding of the sit-down strikes and also the wildcat strikes that followed is that you didn't need an entire workforce, right? You needed a solid minority to basically stop things, and then the question is both, and oftentimes that sort of minority unionism took place among teams that were actually working that were doing something interdependently around some piece of the assembly line where they were actually working together, and it was that kind of collective identity that led them to stop the line, and then that stop rippled through the assembly process. And so the question I have is I think that type of teamwork, at least in a place like Walmart, is somewhat missing and ephemeral. People are all over the place. And secondly, I'm not convinced, although it might not be true, like there may be parts of the supply chain where this is more possible, but if a small group of Walmart workers decides to stop, it just doesn't really matter in a Walmart. That might not be true at a warehouse, but on the shop floor, I think there aren't these points of leverage in the same way, at least on the shop floor. Yeah, Andrew, and then
Well, thank you. I found this completely fascinating, and I'm totally persuaded by all the conclusions. But I do have two questions. The one is, to what extent is this a Walmart story, a low-wage retail story, a service sector story, or the entire U.S. economy in the 21st century story? It's not like things have been going great in the trades or in what's left of U.S. manufacturing for organized labor. The second question is about homophily, and I'm completely persuaded that the homophilous groups of workers are more organizable than the heterogeneous groups of workers, but the vast majority of the homophilous ones aren't organized either. So if you compare homophilous groups to other homophilous groups, what predicts the ones that do join our Walmart versus the 99.8% that don't?
Right, thank you. So let me, and this is an issue with studying one company, is that like how to bound the conclusions that I'm making is a challenge. I see the conclusions being relevant to different extents across different groups, but the claim I'd make is that these are challenges particular to the service sector in many ways. Although, then I'd qualify it by saying, well, Peter Eichler wrote this great book called Hard Sell about retail work, and he shows that, well, Macy's, the structure of production in a place like Macy's is actually really different than a place like Walmart. So this is my long way of saying the claims I want to be making are about the service sector. I think that they're, depending on the claim, I would make them more general or more bounded. On the second point, you're right. Like the truth of the general truth is that very few workers got involved. I'd say either in Fight for 15 or our Walmart. In terms of actual numbers signing up, it's pretty low. It's pretty low as a population. And then that leads to one question you didn't ask, which is when you have such a small proportion of people doing anything, how can you make conclusions about that group in relationship to the population? But the specific question you asked was what types of homophily generate organizing and which types don't?
Yeah, I mean, I can explain this better. I mean, what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
I don't
No, I mean, I actually have. I have a way of answering that
Okay,
question,
yeah.
But you can ask a different.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I would say that some types of homophily are actually about the people's similarity vis-a-vis the production process. That those types of homophily are more likely to generate interest in organizing than homophily based on sort of identity characteristics. But I think then we might be getting back to Rick's question, how are the identities people have in the store related to identities that they have in their communities? And actually, this is something that I am very much interested in, the role of the customer in shaping workers' identities, which is another way of saying, the way that workers often interact with their communities is vis-a-vis the role of the customer. And that, I think one very important difference between manufacturing and the service sector is that customers often appear to workers as adversaries, particularly in places like Walmart that try to minimize staffing levels, and particularly at moments when workers are agitating, which I sort of show in a couple of different contexts. But customers are the least supportive of workers when workers most need their support. And that is a challenge for the kinds of community campaigns that, Rick, you're pointing to as being important to movements of the past. if a community interacts with workers as customers, that undermines the bases for solidarity. So that's a whole sort of separate branch of my research is on this question of consumer worker coalitions. Yes?
Different point, piggyback to what you were mentioning. The first one, in an assembly line, there is a continuation of duties.
Yeah.
That if I don't do A, B won't happen and C won't happen. And at the end of that line, there will be no outcome. When you're working at a store, it doesn't matter if you cashier or not. If you don't show up, there will be no consequences because they will have a plan B or plan C. The other factors to mention is that the people working at Walmart are the people who have, aside from having low skills, they have limited ability to do other jobs. The scheduling is a factor. You don't develop a community if you have a schedule today that you will come back on Tuesday and you don't meet the same people.
Yeah.
So people do not interact. Lunch, you take lunch individual or breaks, not lunch, because most of them don't work full time. They work part time, and the lunch, the break time is a lonesome interaction. When you're working in a factory, there is a set schedule that people will need a certain time, therefore develop a cohesiveness, and they will come up with issues that are sort of similar to others.
Yeah.
So the whole frame of atmosphere developed at a store is so much different than the factory. Therefore, organizing will be complicated and difficult because I don't know the next cashier until 3 or 4 weeks in between, and the communication never happens. I may come in at 9 o'clock today and leave at 3, and then tomorrow I'll be here at 9 o'clock, but the people who were there will not be there until probably 2 weeks. And that's a dynamic that they know why they're doing it. So it happens in that industry for a way of controlling sort of the variables.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I mean, I feel like in some ways you've made the argument I'm trying to make exactly, which is that, I mean, the first piece about the assembly line is like exactly the literature we're trying to engage with. Richard Edwards in Contested Terrain argues that like the assembly line actually gives workers structural power for the reasons you're saying. If you stop, like if a small concerted group of workers can stop work at one point in the assembly line and shut down the production process potentially, like a small minority of workers. And that just can't happen in the retail, at least on the shop floor, exactly as you're saying. Secondly, I would say that like the way that Walmart, so yeah, I think you're right that Walmart definitely knows what it's doing with its scheduling practices, but it's doing a couple different things. One of the things it's doing is responding to varying customer demand. Like that part of its logic is to like adjust schedules depending on when workers are when they want to keep, a similar ratio of like customers to workers over the course of a day, right? So they vary schedules depending on the season, depending on how many people they think are going to be coming into the store. So that's how they understand, in part, the scheduling. But of course, it has all these other implications that they probably also know about undermining the basis for collective identity. Let me just push back a little bit, which is that if we told the other story, like if we could tell a story in which varying schedules actually allow workers to come into contact with a wide range of other workers, to identify their basis of collective identity more. And so we would actually think that workers across a variety of schedules meeting all of their coworkers, they would all, they'd have a wider number of connections, that we could tell a story in which that actually led to more rather than less collective identity. I believe, I'm 100% on board your story. I just think we have to also think about there's a potential story if we might also believe the other story. And so then the question is how much faith do we have in our story if we could believe the other one too. So now I'm overwhelmed. So maybe we'll go, since I met you today, we'll start.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm particularly interested in your third finding, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to what this respect means to workers. I see it across a variety of
Yeah.
potential lines. So is it that workers just don't like authority, which is very plausible, they just don't like people telling them what to do? Is it that workers, you kind of mentioned this union worker, would prefer a buffer between the person telling them what to do and them doing it? Is it about autonomy? So is it that workers want to be able to decide what they do?
Right.
Is it actually about wanting to do one thing? And so you talk about the managers kind of telling you, do this job, do that job, and actually workers miss the assembly line of doing one thing.
Yeah.
What does respect mean, really?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm doing a study now on food delivery work, and almost without fail, like workers who we've been interviewing say that one of the things they love about it is not having someone directing them. Now, the app directs them in completely arbitrary ways, like tells them to go one store rather than another store, pays them different amounts depending on like the time of day. There's a huge amount of uncertainty in the app, but that's different than having someone just tell you what to do every moment of the day. Now, I don't think, I want to distinguish between what I would call domination and authority. Now, I think the difference between domination and authority is that domination is about this sort of how much one person can arbitrarily decide the fate of another person. Authority is about one's capacity to make commands that will be obeyed, but domination is about the sort of arbitrariness of one's capacity to control another. So I think it's that what frustrates people the most is that their manager can make their life good and can make their life hell. And the fact that there's that sort of scope for managers to either, if they like them for whatever random reason, they feel beneficent towards an employee, they can make their life good, and if they don't, they can make their life miserable. I think that's the feeling of that's what I feel like the premium on respect is. The frustration is not about having someone give them sort of directions. It's about the wide scope that I think is particular to the service sector for reasons that I've tried to explain about it, sort of because there's the unpredictability of customers, which companies respond to by giving a lot of discretion to managers, which then allows managers to allocate penalties and favors as they see fit. That's what service workers at places like Walmart are reacting most to. It's that the sort of feeling of being underneath someone's foot, and someone can make your life miserable or good. Alejandra, we'll just move in this direction.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think what you're just saying reminds me a lot of what Latino immigrants were telling me in New York. I didn't frame it as respect, but they were talking a lot about how the managers were treating them in a bad way and how they preferred to work informally or to work for a person they knew because they will have more autonomy and they won't have to suffer that management relationship. And I'm wondering, how does demands inform if workers unionize or not? If they want respect, maybe they're considering other strategies for their own demand that does not require unionizing.
Like, are there other ways of gaining respect?
Like maybe their strategies are others, and turnover becomes a way to improve their conditions. Maybe there is a rationality behind that,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if it's more flexibility what is making them not organized rather than heterogeneity.
So sort of along the lines of the previous comment about the varieties of schedules and unpredictability.
But also
or-
that they have more flexibility to leave the place easily and go to another one. So they don't really build a strong commitment and identity with that place.
Mhm.
And well, this is not useful for me, they are not respecting me, I'll go to another place until they find one where they can be better.
And so this is the point, this is partly the point about the exit option,
Yeah.
and the exit option undermining organizing, which I think is I do think this is a piece of the story for sure, is like the idea, I mean, high turnover rates imply that people do feel, often respond to problems in their work by leaving, and by leaving multiple jobs, which does undermine the possibility of worker organization. On the point about respect, I think this is something that I don't mean to like call you out, but we have an organizer from the organization United for Respect here that you maybe could speak to. But I do think that part of the work that our Walmart has done is in part like to recognize the salience of respect and try to develop infrastructure that's not not exactly like a traditional labor union, but mechanisms by which workers can develop systems for mutual support and also systems for expressing voice to managers that are outside the framework of traditional collective bargaining agreements. So I do think that like part of the like new labor organizations are taking these sort of interpersonal dimensions of work, the importance of respect, for example, seriously, and I think that's very important. Yeah.
What is your opinion on the e-commerce, the new retail platforms
Yeah.
such as Amazon?
That's a great question. I have a way of picking research topics that like become kind of irrelevant right as I pick them. So I like study hospitals like right before Obamacare, and it's like my conclusions are irrelevant. And I study Walmart like right as Amazon starts to dominate retail. So what do I think? What do I think about e-commerce? What do I think about Amazon? I'm still figuring out what I think about it, but I think that a lot of the sort of problems that I identify to organizing in Walmart are actually, if anything, exaggerated in, especially when I'm thinking about like, I don't actually know all that much about, there are great people doing work on Amazon distribution centers. I'm studying right now like the grocery delivery, and there the problems are even greater than the problems are at Walmart. One, because workers who are doing delivery work, they don't see each other. They interact a little bit, but almost none. If you ask them who they interact most with, it's both customers on the one hand, and then it's like other retail employees on the other hand. Like when you're working for Instacart and you go to like Whole Foods, you get to know the cashier and you get to know the customer, but you don't get to know other Instacart workers. And so like the challenge of building collective identity is only exaggerated there, and my sense is that the problem of heterogeneity that I've observed is also even more present in this delivery work. And then the one other sort of positive story about Walmart is that there is a collective feeling of disrespect. Like there is a kind of a nascent consciousness of being disrespected by your manager. And when you're working for one of these companies and you don't have a boss, you're just being you're being directed by an algorithm, like where do you direct your frustration? It's very difficult to imagine how you come together and who you make demands on.
When do you think the fracture came about with the dissatisfaction at Walmart? Because the old commandments of Walton, the founder, I mean, like really it was like the commandments for you would do that, like still have the card. And when do you think there were a shift to no longer be part of this paternalistic company
yeah.
through, and, you know, when?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I would, I can give you the answer that other scholars have given. It's not, mine's not a historical study. Nelson Lichtenstein has done a great historical study of Walmart, the retail revolution, as have others. Walmart begins in Arkansas, Bentonville, Arkansas, and who are the Walmart employees? Well, it's largely like the wives of farmers. And it's like a second income, and it has this whole evangelical bent, and it also reproduces the paternalistic family. You have these male store managers, largely women employees, and there's like this kind of strange to me, but like a sort of paternalistic family thing going on in the stores. And the workers aren't relying on the work for, it's not as central to the family income. And so I think, to me, what's sort of interesting about the transformation of Walmart is that you go from like Walmart being taking advantage of people on the periphery of the labor market to be its staff, right? And then what happens is that Walmart suddenly becomes central to the American economy. So you have this model of employment that's built around workers who are peripheral to the economy, and now lots of people are depending on Walmart for making ends meet. And that's I think when you see people starting to depend on Walmart for a living wage, for like getting by, that's when you start to see this tension between the business model and workers, not expectations, but workers' dispositions. One other thing I would say is that, and this is sort of, one way in which our study is limited, is that we're studying Walmarts largely in metropolitan areas. So if you look at Walmart's history, it starts with Bentonville, and that's like concentric circles out. So you look at basically we're looking at the Walmarts that are in urban areas that are kind of recent areas that are recent Walmart adopters. So the kind of core mission, we might predict that the core sort of values and mission of the organization is like most diffuse in these places, though I actually sort of think at this point the Walmart model is sort of similar everywhere. So, yes.
So, this is all fascinating, and great talk and great project. And since we're getting near the end, this is a kind of unfair meta-theoretical question, maybe. But
Great, my favorite.
So, meta-theoretically, and this is very much a story about tactics, right? I mean, tactics are interesting, they're fun, and in an odd way, they're even optimistic, because although this may be a tactically very difficult context, the image is if we come up with the right tactics for organizing the new economy, we could have a new wave of organizing, like the wave of the 30s and 40s, and a resurgence of unionism. A different story would be a much more macro kind of strategic terrain story that said, look, the last wave was, you had the Depression, a period when workers were about as disempowered as imaginable, and presumably, though I'm not a labor historian, but quite exploited during that period, followed by World War II and the start of the Cold War, where literally, an industrial stoppage was seen as an existential threat to the nation, not just a single company.
Right.
And so you have a bunch of people who had experienced exploitation and suddenly had leverage, and that was the ideal, strategic terrain for organizing.
Yeah.
And and that until you get a strategic terrain like this, no matter what you do tactically, is kind of doomed to be at best marginal and at worst a failure. And I'm wondering where you come down on, that doesn't diminish the sociological interest of studying tactics, right?
Yeah.
But
So,
it may, as far as a practical labor movement perspective, it's a very different.
Yeah. So I would say actually that like a third of the project is about tactics. 2/3 is understanding like why we are where we are. And then a third is trying to unpack like what strategies might conceivably work, partly because I am a Brown graduate, and like I'm trying to think optimistically about how to like make the world better. Like that's sort of what we do, I think. but 2/3 are really understanding like the where workers are now, and I feel like in some ways the part of our intervention, I think, is actually pushing back against this sort of leftist idea that if only like workers are basically ready for mass action now, and it's any minute it's going to happen. And I think that our argument is like, actually, look, this is the terrain in which any labor movement is grappling with. On the macro story, like, I agree with you that we're not in a moment like the 1930s. Maybe we are actually in a movement that's not that dissimilar from the 1930s. And actually, so macro historically, I like to think of this project sort of, or I like to think of like, this set of questions from a Polanyian, like, I don't know, again, I don't know who I'm speaking to exactly. So like Polanyi, I know Andrew reads Polanyi, but this idea that like that like the forces of the market disembed people from their social positions, and that people like try to re-embed the market in social relations, right? What the part that Polanyi, and so I would see the 1930s as like, this is what's happening. Workers recognizing their leverage are trying to re-embed a market within social relations. What Polanyi also says is that this can go in the direction of social welfare or socialism, and it can go in the direction of fascism. And I think actually if I were to tell a meta story, you could start with the Great Recession. You could look at the sort of who was given voice after the Great Recession. And then you could look at voting rates among Walmart workers between 2012 and 2016, which I have. Okay, so you have, this is a survey we did of Walmart workers, who they voted for in 2012. We see about, again, this is a selective sample. This is the people who answered our survey. We have about 55% voted for Obama, and about 30% voted for Romney. 2016, you have about 32% voting for Clinton and over 50% voting for Trump. So I think that, part of the story I would tell is actually we see this moment of populism among some segments of the working class, and it's in today's moment we're seeing a right-wing populism, partly because there hasn't been a space offered for a left-wing populism or a sort of social democratic re-embedding. So instead we're seeing the rise of sort of this nativist America First support for Trumpism. Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I had Rick and then.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to, if you go back to, I'm going to go back to Jonathan's point about the third finding about respect, because I think that that's really, really important. So there's really two stories, and especially with trying to do the analogy with industrial unionism. The story that comes up is like, well, small numbers of people, they could shut it down, or because of scheduling things, they could come together. But that's not why people joined. That was why unions sometimes had power or not. And so I think we have to separate the story, which is why do people affiliate to these associations that bring them together, as opposed to why can organizations, under what circumstance can they have power? And I think sometimes we conflate them. We think, oh, the reason why they don't join is because we don't have a setup like a factory, which I don't necessarily think is true, because if you think of the scheduling issue, we know that there are unions for flight attendants, transportation workers, users. They didn't see a lot of other people, waitresses in the Midwest in the 30s and 40s that were going from different restaurants to think about Dorothy Soup Cobble's work. And so it's not scheduling per se, nor is it the ability to hold out hold up the work, it's something else. And that's why I think this thing about respect and identity is so important, because if you go back and think of, like the Freeman and Rogers book, what do workers want? Right, well, they want to go to work where they don't have a lot of fighting, right? There's a lot of conflict in their life already, so they like that. They want to go where they feel like they're valued.
Yeah.
And respected. And of course, they want some material benefits too, but what was important was that they wanted something else. And if you think about what you're saying here and what you're hearing and what you're reporting in your quotes, it's something about that. And that was also what Dorothy Sue Cobble talks about. Waitresses, they get organized, because it used to be, single women working in places that serve liquor. That wasn't good, but if suddenly they had a profession, an occupation that gave them a sense of being. And I was a grad student when the Harvard clerical workers were, at least when they finally won, because I know there were several.
This is when we started.
Yeah, okay, so I was there when they, and what I thought was so interesting, and I remember passing this on to our local graduate student organizers, which is, they had this great phrase at the end, which is you don't have to hate Harvard to love the union, right? So it didn't have to be negative. Right? It could be like you're getting something else, you're building a community. It's a community that of course will improve your conditions, but it's a community that gives you something that takes you out of the isolation of your library position, your lab position, or something like that. So I think building, if we're thinking about like where to go now, where people feel so atomized, where they care about identity issues and things like that, maybe that's something that can organize. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is your Walmart story, and especially the stuff that we'll talk about later, is about the double sort of being service-oriented and consumers. But it might be an opportunity because of linkage issues. So Walmart, otherwise terrible employer, is one of the largest organic grocers in the country, right? Is the largest supplier of marine certified, marine stewardship certified fish, right? So the people who care about that, who also go to Walmart, is there a way of linking those issues to, like, if you care about the environment and organics, what about caring about labor decency and fairness?
So, thanks, those are both great points. I'll take them both. How much time do we have?
I don't know, Andrew's running this, so.
In theory, we have 20 more minutes.
But in practice, we don't want to go on forever.
Yeah, why don't you
but-
take another 10 minutes or so?
Okay, great. So I think on the question of respect, I think that's really right. And when I think about grad student organizing, grad students in some ways, when I talk to my grad students, like in some ways it's cushy, right? You are paid to be in school. Like, how much better does it get than that? On the other hand, in terms of like someone having arbitrary control over you, the ability for one person to make your life miserable or good, I think that like there's a lot of domination within like graduate schools, at least at Columbia. I don't know how it is, but like
Nothing's as bad as Columbia, but it happens here too.
But in terms of like the scale, the scope, like for how bad an advisor can make a grad student's life, I think there's quite a lot, and I think that's in part why you see the rise of graduate student unions. Is it's not about necessarily material conditions, although of course dental benefits are like important. It's about being able to like have some protection against the arbitrary domination of your supervisor. On the second point, I really agree on needing to make these connections, and like part of my own thinking is like the traditional tactic we have for thinking for like the way consumers can support workers is like the boycott, right? And like there's a long history of like the great boycott, and this has been really effective in the past. But I also wonder if there are other, if there are ways of, rather than using that kind of like the exit strategy, we're going to just withdraw our market power collectively, whether there are ways of consumers actually helping workers seeing the linkages, but also materially supporting workers. So for example, well, there are a bunch of examples, but if delivery workers are actually only interacting with customers and grocery store workers, is there a way for customers to actually start a conversation about the union? You know, the National Domestic Workers Union, when they're trying to like organize domestic workers, one thing they did was they pretended they like they responded to ads on care.com. They would pay domestic workers to come over for an interview and then talk to them about their work and compensate them for it. But it was like using the channel of the consumer worker interaction as a way of building organization. So I think there are a number of ways of thinking about like how can you take this liability, which is like the kind of tendency for adversarial relations between workers and customers, and actually turn that into an asset. And so I have a whole sort of spiel about customer salts, right? An organizer can't go into a store and organize now. At least in, our Walmart got banned from like 5 states, but a shopper can. A shopper can go in and shop and talk about the union. And anyway, but so yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I wanted to just address the disrespect piece, and then maybe I'll try and be concise and also talk a little bit about tactics. So I am an organizer for organization United for Respect, and I think what disrespect looks like and means in the context of being a retail worker, it is really specific, right? It is all of the things you would imagine of what humiliation looks like. What, as you were mentioning, being cross-trained across different departments and being understaffed on every shift, and just the sort of volume of labor that is required, and that that you can be fired if you can't keep up with these these are the things that we hear all the time, and it's not just from Walmart workers and associates, but across retail. And I think that, what has been really interesting in sort of the organizing model of our Walmart that we have now expanded and we're now using and implementing across other retailers is this conversation with retail workers about what does respect mean to you. And it connects you to a whole range of issues, right? Scheduling is not just about scheduling, it's about not being able to count on your paycheck, right? It's about
Not being able to
Yes.
count on your life next week because
Exactly.
they won't give you your hours, you can't go out with your
Exactly, yeah.
friends.
And to connect that to a question of disrespect, which is connected to, I'm contingent, it's my manager who gets to decide my hours, who gets to decide whether I can make my rent or, if I'm gonna have to decide between paying bills. That's what it looks like on the real concrete, real practical level. And so I think that an organizing model that is so centered around people talking about that and articulating for themselves what does respect look like in their workplace, and what does and I think your framing of domination is exactly right, and that has been the most sort of useful way of organizing people. And you can organize people in their stores and in their communities, but also online when you're having a conversation, which is what we do in our non-Walmart organizing. And so the other piece is just the tactics component of how does this connect to the broader labor movement, right? What does it look like? At least in our non-Walmart organizing, there's also this question of, the role of looking at the takeover of retail by Wall Street companies, and so looking at sort of corporate analysis of these companies, and in the case of things like Toys R Us and Sears and Kmart, and the role of private equity firms and hedge funds, and trying to find points of leverage there, which has been a very central part of the organizing strategy as well. And then there was one last thing, but I can't recall, so I'll just say also, about National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is so cool, is they were also able to look at, consumers and employers, in many ways, the people who employ domestic workers are both, right? They are the employers, and they're also, so I think just their really interesting organizing model was able to, come out of that. So, anyways.
Thanks.
I would love to,
Oh,
everything that you mentioned, but it's also, on the other side, it takes a village to get 75% of the staff working at Walmart. There is the people that are addicted, that are in recovery, that have a whole community working for them. There are individuals with disability, aside from the substance abuse that could be added to. So you have the workers that are working for those people in order for them to maintain the jobs. And most of the time, they don't even know that organizing is part of the equation. They're grateful that they have a job. And in regards to the schedule, you don't know how powerful it is for you not to know when you're gonna go to work. So that's part of the disrespect, that they call you at 9 o'clock and say be here at 10 because the person that was supposed to be there called at 8:30 or 9:30, 45. So that kind of disrespect. The disrespect is also knowing that you have a disability and the demographics of individuals that are working in there, immigrants, most of them, individual, as I mentioned before. And it's not the same organizing someone at Harvard that organizing someone with low skills and ability to learn and organize and be aware of the surrounding as it is at Walmart. It's a whole set of dynamics, completely different.
Agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I said theoretically, what I meant was
Yeah.
practically, Adam has to be across campus by 6 o'clock. So we should probably thank him for a very stimulating seminar and wrap up and say thanks.